clear-eyed lawmakers left the Statehouse shortly before midnight last Friday, but not with a deal on the education bill that's dominated the 2025 legislative session.
And this is a big deal with education transformation. And if we need a little extra time to take care of that, we need to take it and make sure we get this right.
Plus, marathon talks over a potentially historic reform package failed to yield a compromise, and Vermont lawmakers postponed adjournment until mid-June to give negotiators more time to work. During this lull in legislative action, we're going to pull back the curtain on the inner workings of the Statehouse to discuss some often overlooked players who influence the bills that make it to the governor's desk. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's Moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Hi, and thanks for joining us on Vermont This Week. I'm Mitch Wertlieb, and on the panel today we have Pete Hirschfeld from Vermont Public and Hannah Basset, investigative reporter from 7 Days. Thank you both so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. And we've got a lot to talk about with what's going on. Everyone's been talking about the action or inaction at the legislature, Pete. And bring us up to date. Where are we now with this education reform bill? We know that it did not get passed. When can we expect lawmakers to get back and possibly pass something?
Well, that has, up until very recently, been a bone of contention between House and Senate lawmakers. When they called off talks late Friday night, I think a lot of us were under the impression that rank and file lawmakers would be going home, but that House and Senate negotiators would be returning early this week to resume those talks and avail themselves of this 2-week period between then and when House and Senate rank and file lawmakers will be coming back to vote on the bill to iron out their differences. That's not what happened. Instead, the House sent a letter to the Senate and they said, hey, how about if we come back together next Thursday? This is just a few days before lawmakers will be returning to the Statehouse. The Senate said, that does not sound good at all to us. We think we should be meeting as early and as often as possible so that we can come to a deal. And they had some pretty harsh letter and a language back to the House. In response to that proposed schedule, they said it seems like it would be likely to leave them without an agreement in hand when lawmakers do come back. And they also said, and this is a direct quote, Vermonters would have every reason to believe that we were not taking our work on education transformation seriously by waiting that long. Wow. The House responded by saying, well, okay, we'll start meeting next Wednesday instead of next Thursday. So huge differences over this education reform bill still, but still these disagreements over process, over how to go about the business of doing these negotiations.
And Pete, is it reflective of the fact that, the Senate seems to want to move quicker, as does Governor Phil Scott on this? The House seems to want to pull back a little bit and say these are complex things, we need more time. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think there's also still disagreements over the substance of the bill. When this session started, I think all of us thought that the major points of contention on education reform would be between the democratically controlled legislature and Republican Governor Phil Scott. That's really not how it's sugared off. The most intense tension right now is between House and Senate leadership. So they have a lot to work out between now and next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, when we may or may not get a vote on a final bill.
This is such a big, complex issue, and it's so important for the state of Vermont. Hannah Basset, I want to talk about a really fascinating article you wrote for 7 Days about sort of the machinations of all of this, getting into Ways and Means Committee and the role that lobbyists play here. They're important. Why are they important to this process?
In a citizen legislature, there is not a tremendous amount of professional resources that the legislators can lean on. There are attorneys in the Office of Legislative Counsel, in the Joint Fiscal Office that legislators can turn to, but in many regards, the folks who are in the State House drafting these bills that become our laws, they're not subject matter experts. They don't have a tremendous amount of time during the legislative session to get big policy reform done. And in some ways, these lobbyists and advocates are a welcome resource to a lot of these legislators. They are folks who often are subject matter experts. They're eager to get in the room and put their finger on the scale, and they're a constant presence in the Statehouse. And we've seen that with education reform in particular. It's been a long journey for this education bill. Obviously, that journey is still continuing. Lobbyists are involved in so many issues, pretty much every issue you can think of that is up for discussion in the Statehouse, but it's certainly been one that that has been shaped in large part by the lobbyists in the education space in Vermont this year.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned putting their fingers on the scale, so there's kind of a dual role here. And Pete, I'm sure you've seen this too, where the lobbyists, yes, they're bringing very important information for these legislators to know how to craft an education bill, but they've got an agenda too, right?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
And, you know, what's interesting about watching lobbyists move through the building is just getting a sense for the depth of the relationships that they've been able to cultivate with individual lawmakers. There's lobbyists that have been working in Montpelier for decades in some instances, and a big part of their process is not just what goes on in the halls of the Statehouse, but meeting with folks outside the confines of the Golden Dome to become real friends in some cases with these folks. And, you know, there are people lobbying for things like the education reform bill or housing, Vermont-specific issues, but there are lobbyists who are representing national interest in some cases. Google has 7 lobbyists contracted in Montpelier. Airbnb has 9 people that could work on its behalf. DraftKings, the sports betting site, has 7 people it has registered as lobbyists in Montpelier. So no matter the issue, you can be pretty sure that if there's going to be a bill that affects operations in any way, there's going to be a lobbyist standing by to try to get a word in edgewise with a lawmaker.
They outnumber legislators 3 to 1 just about. So they're not all there every day in the Statehouse, but they are, as Pete said, they are on every issue.
But what's interesting too, Hannah Basset, is that, you know, as Pete was talking about, you've got the outside influences for sure, but then there are players that Vermonters would be more familiar with. You wrote about in your article what you call the 3 V's. In lobbying here. Who are we talking about when we talk about the 3 V's and their influence on this debate about education reform?
In education, these are, the V's are kind of colloquially known in the education space and in the Statehouse as 3 advocacy groups, lobbying groups that have been particularly involved this year and in many years on this education bill in particular, though. It's the Superintendents Association, the School Boards Association, and the Principals Association. We saw them particularly active when the education reform bill was moving through the House. If you kind of watched the content of that bill shift and evolve between when the language was introduced from how the Scott administration first entered that bill into the House and how the bill passed out of the House, a lot of the reforms that were in the final version of that House bill really echoed the reforms put forward by the V's. And the V's kind of came together. They recognized that they had more collective influence, advocating together. And you know, that's a common strategy with some advocacy groups. Instead of kind of pulling in slightly different directions, they realized that they could be more effective if they all rowed in the same direction.
It's almost like collective bargaining in a way.
Exactly, yeah. So, of course, that was just kind of one half of the bill's evolution so far. Then it moved to the Senate, where there were kind of different players involved. The committee chairs in the Senate have different perspectives that they were more receptive to. They brought in slightly different groups and kind of the perspectives that ended up represented in the Senate version when it got to the Senate floor for a vote reflected those differences, more independent school voices, for example. So these lobbyists, these advocates, it can shift in chamber to chamber, committee to committee.
But the influence is undeniable, right, Pete?
And these organizations and individuals that are advocating and lobbying for or against these bills are going to play an outsized role in what we see happen with this education reform bill during this final stage here. If an organization like the Vermont NEA decides that it can't abide this legislation, it can really gum up the works in the House, especially, and sort of break apart this very uneasy alliance that may or may not be forming to get this bill across the finish line. So these 11th hour negotiations are sometimes when lobbyists are able to be most effective at either getting something done or making sure it doesn't get done.
I really briefly want to go over something that Hannah Basset talked about with, how the bill changed from what, say, Governor Phil Scott would like to have seen after the 3 Vs sort of had their influence on it. We're looking at things like consolidation was a major concern, right? The districts, the size of the districts. What changed? What were they able to sort of gain to pull back from Governor Scott's vision of what he wanted to see?
I think the Vs and other people in the education community more broadly were really concerned about the governor's proposal insofar as it would have seen Vermont spend $180 or $200 million less, I think it was, on education. The governor sees this as a cost-cutting measure, as that being one of the chief goals for this bill. The House is very worried about educational opportunities, and they feel like less money means less opportunity. And so one of the big changes we saw in the Senate was a reversion to some degree to Phil Scott's position insofar as it might not have spent as much as Vermont spends currently on education. Now, that's changed in the interim, but obviously still a lot of very substantive issues for them to work out.
But some of the classic things too, Hannah, like smaller schools in rural areas, there's concern about those closing. Were those concerns brought up during these negotiations, and did they have an effect on why we're still at this impasse?
That was certainly a big concern that was voiced when the bill came before the House for a vote. Talking with legislators and lobbyists, a lot of people discussed education as an issue that doesn't fall neatly along party lines. It really—
That's something Pete Hirschfeld's been saying for weeks now. Yeah, you can't define this in the traditional way.
It really confounds that dichotomy. And so when representatives on the House floor were speaking their concerns or advocating for the bill before taking the vote on the House floor, a lot of the concerns that people voiced were about closures of smaller schools in their districts. So there was speaking of advocacy groups, there was a group that formed this year that made a relatively big mark pretty early on for a new group, a Rural School Community Alliance, that was able to get relatively notable traction for an advocacy group that was newer. The Vs, for example, are very established. They have large membership groups. These are known entities, but I think the Rural School Community Alliance, like kind of that group was able to pull on that concern that they were hearing from representatives and communities worried about that school closure. Certainly at the time when the bill was through the House. And I think many members haven't let go of that concern now either.
Yeah, that seems to be a big issue all the time whenever education changes come up. We've talked a lot about the legislators having to burn the midnight oil here, and they're going to have to come back. They're working hard. The Office of Legal Counsel, Pete Hirschfeld, has really been working very hard. So can you sort of describe what they do and why they've had to put in so many hours?
Yeah, these are the workhorses of the legislative branch. The House lawmakers introduced, I think, 551 bills. The Senate introduced another 150, 60, 70 bills. And every one of those bills has to be drafted by a member of the Legislative Council. It's not a huge staff, as Hannah's reported on. Yeah. When those bills start to get debated in committee, there are multiple drafts of each one. When you get into the latter stages of the legislature, when House and Senate negotiators are talking well into the night, it falls to legislative counsel not just to oversee those meetings and answer questions, but also to go back to the office after lawmakers leave and make sure that there's a fresh draft ready to go the next morning. There are fewer people in Montpelier who are working harder than the joint fiscal analysts and the lawyers for the legislature during this time of year. And they can't show it. They have to keep their poise, they have to keep their cool, and even when they're getting incredibly frustrating questions from lawmakers, they have to keep a straight face and play the role of customer service.
So interesting. Hannah Basset, are they staffed adequately enough? Or are these folks kind of in danger of burning out in a way, based on what Pete just described?
It's a question that is coming up more and more. The office was established in the 70s and it's grown since then. Now it's the Office of Legislative Counsel, for example, is staffed at just under 30 or so people. And again, these folks work a tremendous amount, particularly during the legislative session. They work year round, but between January and May, now June, as the session drags on, it's a full court press for these folks. So there's discussion, and there have been studies into looking at whether the office is sufficiently staffed to meet that demand placed on them. At the start of the session, there was a kind of request put out again to have that be continually looked at to see if perhaps more staffing could be added to reduce the demands, and also look at the compensation for staff as well, to not only see if compensation was sufficient to attract the caliber of staff needed, but also to retain folks. As discussed, this is an incredibly demanding job. And you need really sharp minds, and you want to keep them. It's an incredible amount of institutional knowledge that people develop over just one session. So former directors of the office have spoken about how important it is to keep these people on board.
Yeah, the sausage getting made, there's so much that goes into that, and I'm really glad you're able to pull back that curtain a little bit and let us know a little more on that. Now, okay, so we don't know what's going to happen with education reform yet. We'll see if they can come to an agreement on that. We do know, Pete Hirschfeld, that a housing bill actually did get hammered out. What's the practical effect on that going to be? What can we expect to see now that this bill is passed? Well,
that's the big question, Mitch. What lawmakers are thinking here is that, just to step back for a moment, every time there's a new house built in a community, that house is taxed, right? The homeowner is taxed, and a lot of that money goes back to Vermont's education fund to fund public schools. What lawmakers have done is create a program where they say to municipalities, hey, if you build the infrastructure that's needed for all these new houses that Vermont needs to actually be built, then when those new houses come online, you get to keep all that tax revenue that would otherwise be going to the education fund. And this bill specifically says that the legislature is willing to forego up to $200 million in tax revenue a year over the next 10 years in the hopes that that will compel municipalities to take on the debt that's needed to build water and sewer lines and everything else you need for housing development, with the promise that the resulting development will pay back, or more than pay back, what they've taken on in debt. That's a theory. There are a lot of people who don't subscribe to that theory. And so we're going to find out. There were a lot of people walking around the building after the deal was struck on this saying, amazing, $2 billion over the next 2 years for housing development in Vermont. It's yet to be seen, though, whether these smaller municipalities specifically are going to be willing to go into hawk in order to have this housing get built and hopefully get the money back they need to pay.
And is
it off.
that the concern you're talking about with those who aren't so sure that the theory will work out the way they hope?
Well, they're also worried that there are municipalities and developers with projects that are ready to go that don't need this tax incentive, that are just going to be there to collect it anyway, and that the legislature is foregoing revenue that would otherwise go to the education fund, and they're worried about the impact on property tax, right? Less money going to the education fund means that everybody else has to spend more in order to fund public schools.
Yeah, and we know that this year they were able to keep the property tax rate sort of flat, about 1%. But again, that bill comes due next year. We have to see what happens then. Things could change a lot. We're talking about things like housing. Another thing you wrote about, Hannah Basset, was sort of the ethics concerns at the Statehouse. And I know this dates back to 2019, but I found this kind of fascinating that 50% of state senators who were crafting legislation dealing with things like tenant protections were actually landlords themselves. Are these concerns that folks are having about possible conflicts of interest?
It's a citizen legislature, so it's always a concern that the folks who are in the Statehouse crafting these policies could stand to benefit from some of the policies that they are making. There are ethics rules, ethics panels that are kind of watching over these to make sure that people do not abuse these powers. There are also ethics disclosures that help shed light on people's potential conflicts of interest, what their outside jobs might be if they hold a second job in addition to their role in the part-time legislature. The Senate also helps shed light, for example, on outside investments that a senator might hold. So there's information that the public can look at if they are interested to be more informed about what might be influencing or informing a legislator's vote. But those disclosures can be a little tricky to access. They can be a little sparse on certain fields of information that can help shed light on that. But landlords is a particularly overrepresented, statistically speaking, overrepresented group of people in the legislature.
I do want to emphasize again that the article I was talking about, you were referencing 2019, that was happening. So that was a few years back. Pete, I do want to get to this. There was hope among Vermont's cannabis growers, small growers especially, that they would be able to get some legislation passed saying they could sell directly to consumers. That did not happen. What's the update on that?
So I think characterizing what they were looking for as direct to consumers is a bit of a misnomer, at least related to the provision that was in play at the later stages of the process, which would have allowed growers to accompany licensed retailers to a farmer's market and engage with customers, talk to them about their product, and the customer could buy it. But that buyer would still be buying from the licensed retailer, right? So it's not direct to consumer.
Not quite direct.
Yeah, I think the white whale for a lot of growers is to get that direct to consumer law in place, where somebody could go to their farm and buy directly from the person who grew that cannabis and not through a licensed retailer. We're a long ways away from that in Vermont. Even the farmers market provision did not make it into the last version of the bill. So even this summer, folks will not be seeing any cannabis sales at their local farmers market.
So the House said no to this, but did say they would be willing to revisit it in the future, right? So it's not a totally done deal.
This is a young industry, right? We're just a few years into it, and there's going to be enormous evolution in the coming years. So stay tuned.
With strong advocates in the Statehouse who likely will keep bringing this up as well.
Absolutely.
Finally, I want to let people know that in Franconia, New Hampshire, a giant sculpture of a 3-foot-long banana was stolen. The police don't have any leads yet, but don't worry, they're going to keep their eyes peeled. Yes, I did save that for the very end of the show. Thank you. It had to happen. This week we chose to do a deep dive about the inner workings of the Statehouse, and there was some stories we didn't get to. We'll talk about them coming up on Vermont This Week in future shows, and you can always check out our reporting at vermontpublic.org. In the meantime, I want to thank our panelists today, Pete Hirschfeld from Vermont Public and Hannah Basset, investigative reporter with 7 Days. Thank you so very much for being here. I'm Mitch Wertlieb, and we hope you'll join us again next week for Vermont This Week.